Welcome to our conversation on Sri Lanka, uh, an extremely topical issue at the moment. And joining me today is Dr. Ganeshan Vignaraja. Dr. Vignaraja is currently non-resident senior fellow at the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore and senior research associate at the ODI in London. He has more than 3 decades of development economics experience at the Asian Development Bank, at the Commonwealth Secretariat, at the International Monetary Fund, and he was also the executive director of the Lakshman Kadirgama Institute of International Relations in Colombo. Welcome, Dr. Vignaraja. It's a pleasure to have you with us. We also have Dr. Samata Mallampatti, who's a research fellow at the Indian Council for World Affairs. She has done her PhD in South Asian Studies at the Jawaharlal Nehru University and has been following developments in Sri Lanka and has written about them in the form of a publication that was brought out by the ICWA on India-Sri Lanka relations. Thank you for joining us, Samata. It's a pleasure to have you. Let me, first of all, start with you, Dr. Vignaraja. Where are we at the moment? We know that there is a state of emergency. We know that there are shoot-at-sight orders. We know that the Prime Minister has resigned. So starting from that, what is the current state of political play?
So at present, Sri Lanka has lost its Prime Minister. Mahinda Rajapakse has resigned. And we are waiting to see what the next steps, which will be initiated by the President and Parliament, which are the two key actors. On the President's front, the protesters are asking him also to go, and so that new administration may be formed by the opposition led by Sajith Premadasa. And that is one scenario. A second scenario is that Parliament itself can elect a president and a prime minister from amongst their membership, providing the president resigns. And that could be some eminent person acceptable to all the parties. So on the political front, I think the scenarios are beginning to be clearer. And today at 3 o'clock, there is a meeting of leaders of the parliamentary parties. The president has yet to appoint a new government, which is a third possible scenario that may be. And we may end up in a cohabitation scenario if somebody is willing to be prime minister while serving under President Rajapakse. At the same time, the IMF talks are continuing to rescue the economy in Sri Lanka at a technical level, pending a finance minister being appointed. Street protests, I believe, have calmed down in Sri Lanka. The military are on the streets. There's shoot-on-sight orders, but there are sporadic incidents throughout the country. And I think the curfew is in place till Thursday coming. And I think after 6 days, they have to get parliamentary approval. So the situation is fluid, but there seems to be some element of calm, and one hopes will be more rational as we go forward.
Well, I hope so too. But currently, the impasse seems to be that the opposition so far, or even the street protests, seem to be demanding the resignation of President Rajapakse and don't seem to be satisfied merely with the stepping down of Prime Minister Rajapakse. So given that it is going to be a touch and go kind of a situation, whether the president also has to step down finally for an interim system to come into play. Because as I understand, the Prime Minister had to be evacuated with the military escort and is supposedly in an undisclosed location, some naval base or something like that, for his own security.
The situation indeed, from the president's point of view, is complicated. In his own mind, I guess he feels he has a couple of years left in his term, because these incidents happened mid-term when the country defaulted and the protests have come. So he would like to stay in power, I suspect. And also there's probably an element of, by him staying in power, and given that we have an executive presidency, there is absolute power within the system vested in that office, and he wants to be able to protect the interests of the family in general, which will be there. On the other hand, the protesters see the default of the Sri Lankan economy to foreign debt as a major blotch on the country, and also the set of shortages that we face, fuel, food, medicine, general chaos, are all attributed to him. And these things, if you look at Latin America, usually come in the wake of a debt default, and the protesters are blaming the president for this, as well as the general populace. And what is quite stunning is the reversal of fortunes of President Rajapakse and former Prime Minister Mahinda Rajapakse, because remember, they were elected on a 2/3 majority. 6.9 million Sri Lankans voted for them not so long ago. So it's quite a dramatic turnaround in the fortunes of this group of people.
What has led to this turnaround? I mean, today what we are seeing is the political crisis, but behind this, what lies? The economic crisis which has sparked off this political uncertainty.
So the starting point for me is the 12th of April, when Sri Lanka announced that it would soft default on its foreign debt. In other words, it temporarily suspended payment to foreign creditors of debt and interest payments. And this was the bilateral creditors, countries like China, India, and Japan, as well as the private creditors, the holders of our bonds. Multilateral debt, of course, as you know, is outside this equation. Now, this crisis of debt really has three sources or buckets of factors behind it. The first is you have a weak economy that was in evidence since the end of the conflict in 2009. For years, Sri Lanka had what they call twin deficits, balance of payments and trade deficits, as well as financial deficits. And this was a situation fueled by basically difficult running of public finances. You then have on top of this external events which came. So COVID was a major blotch on the economy, and the economy collapsed, minus 3.6% growth in 2020, which was significant, and threw 500,000 extra people into poverty in Sri Lanka, reversing all the gains from the past. And then you have the Russia-Ukraine crisis, which dramatically raised inflation, particularly food prices and fuel prices. And inflation to April this year on a year-on-year basis is some 30%, and food inflation is some 50% in Colombo and the environment around it. So these three factors have been important. And then on top of that, you've had policy missteps by the government. So the Rajapakse administration in 2019 announced tax cuts, which were not really called for by business, which dented the revenue. The IMF estimates some 2% of Sri Lanka's revenue was lost, 2% as a percentage of GDP through the tax cuts. Then there was another policy misstep, which was sudden announcement overnight of moving to organic fertilizers, away from chemical fertilizers, which were then banned. And farmers were not prepared, and this has had a disastrous impact on food production and productivity. Third, the government tried to keep the exchange rate at a fixed level without having the reserves to manage it. And fourth, they printed money as a way of trying to boost the economy, which has led to also high inflation. And finally, I think the biggest misstep really of the Rajapakse administration, and something that the protesters are talking about, is they appointed 4 officials to run the economy who have let the side down very badly. Sri Lanka delayed for 18 months going to the IMF. And these officials, I think, who were the former central bank governor, the former treasury secretary, and a couple of other advisors, really have let the side down very badly by not calling early warning on the crisis that was coming, and particularly the debt crisis and foreign repayment. So it's quite a complex set of factors, but I think all of these come into play.
Dr. Malampati, let me ask you, I think from what Dr. Vignaraja has said, we see the tax cuts in 2019, the impact of that getting compounded, government revenues shrinking as a result of the tax cuts, but then shrinking further because of COVID, tourism suffering hugely in Sri Lanka, as also in the rest of the world, and then followed by the shift ban of chemical fertilizers and the attempted switch, which was not properly planned, to organic farming. So how do you look at this combination, or in your assessment, you've been following this, Why is it that Sri Lanka, which has otherwise been one of the more successful economies in South Asia, how did Sri Lanka end up making one policy mistake after another policy mistake, and so that the errors kind of compounded, as it were?
Yes, sir. I think, as you said, that this is a very unprecedented situation for Sri Lanka, also the economic situation. And I think largely the government has ignored the warnings earlier. I think various economists and others have told the government that there is going to be a crisis if the balance of payments and other issues of the economy are not taken care of. And I think even in 20 care of. So this is, I think, largely the government has ignored the warnings. And other than that, so as you said, Sri Lanka was once considered as an example of a country where the welfarist model was really successful there. And then various governments have switched from one economic model to the other. And, they were uprisings also in 1960s and 70s as a result of that. And I think there is no policy clarity, maybe because, for instance, the UNP government, the main focus was on the economic market-led economy, and the SLPP government, which came to power in between, the focus was more on the state-led economy. So this differences, these contradictions probably must have piled up, and along with the 30 years of the ethnic conflict which Sri Lanka has seen, where the foreign investment has also suffered. So I think all these things, I think the policy decisions might have piled up for Sri Lanka and led to this crisis and the COVID. The way it has been handled, though India has helped Sri Lanka in many ways to tackle the COVID and the COVID situation in Sri Lanka by providing economic assistance, but then just during the COVID, just after the COVID pandemic, the decisions taken regarding the economy, like Sir also said about the fertilizer issue, is one example, for instance. So these are all led to the food crisis. So I think it's basically the policy decisions or largely ignoring the actual root causes of the problem probably has led to the crisis today in Sri Lanka.
Dr. Vignaraja, you must be following the negotiations with the IMF that are underway, and understandably, Finance Minister Ali Sabri has now quit. So the discussions would be at an official level. But given the magnitude of the crisis, what is the kind of prescription that you expect that the IMF is likely to come up with, and how palatable is it going to be?
So there are three sort of dimensions of Sri Lanka coming out of this crisis that are important. The first is a conversation with the creditors that needs to be done before an IMF program takes place. And this is complicated because of the different types of creditors. You have the bilaterals, such as India, China, and Japan. You have the private bondholders, which are the largest group in Sri Lanka. And you have also the multilaterals that are excluded. A second thing is the IMF program itself. And the IMF program typically will require two elements. One is a rapid financing instrument that is needed of about $400 million that Sri Lanka can get, providing it shows it has appointed a law firm and a debt advisor. These are the two preconditions, and a government needs to be in place for that to happen. The second is an enhanced facility, which is about $3 billion, $1 billion a year that Sri Lanka is wanting. That requires to show some substantial process in the discussions with creditors. Now, the IMF program itself will involve, I guess, a combination of revenue raising, which is woefully inadequate. So Sri Lanka's revenue to GDP ratio is some 8 to 9% around now, where it was historically at 14, 15%. So significant revenue needs to be raised. There will be expenditure reform that will also have to come. We have a bloated public sector, sadly, with practically 1 million plus people in the public sector. We have a very large military, which has not been demobilized since the end of the conflict. Some of these will have to be looked at. There's also large state enterprises, the electricity board, the Sri Lankan Airlines, which are loss-making, which have to be looked at. And then the exchange rate will have to be better managed in some process. And then apart from that, I think the whole process of managing the debt, I think, needs to be looked at. Infrastructure projects will have to be much more carefully looked at. So there will be austerity measures. And then the very last part of the program is really to have a program of structural reforms which can bring inclusive growth down up in the future, because IMF programs typically lead to a reduction in growth, and that is already difficult in a weak economy.
If we were to put some numbers, let's say about, you said there are three kinds of debt, the bilateral, the multilateral agencies, and the bondholders. So if you were to break it down a little more in terms of the total debt and what becomes due and all the rest of it, how does that?
So Sri Lanka, as of now, has around $6 billion of repayment it has to make this year, and the reserves are down to some 1.8 billion. This is what the central bank has told us. But the finance minister, before he resigned, talked about usable.
He said about 50 million.
Yes, 50 million. That's right. So the 1.8 billion of usable reserves includes a swap that came from the People's Bank of China, which is in Chinese yuan and has to be spent on trade with China, right? So then when you take out that, the gold and some other numbers, you get down to a very low number, under $100 million of reserves. Now, when you break down the total debt that is owed externally, it breaks down like this. About 47 billion, about 47% of that is owed to private capital markets. Okay, so about half the debt is private capital markets, 10% to China, 10% to Japan, 2% to India. And then I think there are the multilaterals, 10% to ADB, some smaller percentage to the World Bank, and so on. So it's really a kind of a private debt crisis with a couple of significant bilaterals in the game as well.
So the borrowings from, you said 47% is from the private market. So where did this go to finance the fighting, the war? Did this go to finance infrastructure? Where did this go?
So Sri Lanka started issuing international sovereign bonds about a decade ago, as it graduated away from grant and concessionary aid. I mean, this was one of the big transitions. As you become a sort of a middle-income country, which we became, there's less willingness of international agencies to lend you money or give you money at concessional rates or grant rates. So Sri Lanka then had to borrow. And this partly financed the general budget and so on. And Sri Lanka has, historically run large fiscal deficits. Part of this was the conflict, of course, but also part of it was the very large welfare state that Sri Lanka maintained. Sri Lanka has a British-style welfare system of free health and education. And this expenditure has gone beyond what is affordable. So the combination of military spending, which is still, I believe, the largest item in the budget of Sri Lanka, even though we have not been in a conflict state for, a decade or so, plus a very large welfare expenditure on health and education, which are a good thing from a human right point of view, but the concomitant revenue and growth has to come if one is going to pay for this kind of, British Western style welfare. These are some of the major sources. And then one of the biggest items on the revenue side, the drawing of revenue, was the debt repayments, which was some 70% of the revenue in terms of equivalent, right? So debt interest payments have been very high in recent times because there's a bunching of the debt interest payments. So these are the three big elements, as I see it, in the call on Sri Lanka's public finances.
So the expenditure reform that you talked about, how will that impact, let's say, the welfare schemes? I can understand that one side would be the cutting down on the defense budget, which you said still remains a major chunk of government expenditure. But in terms of the welfare schemes, you talked of the public sector, you talked of the public sector corporations like the Sri Lankan Airlines and other such parastatal organizations. How does that impact the average citizen?
So
in your words, is kind of used to free education, free health, etc., etc.
So in an austerity scenario, which is what will come with an IMF program, right? Population are already suffering quite dramatically. And there are these protests that are taking place, and there's a whole political risk issue concerned with any kind of stabilization of the economy, which one wants. The thing that Sri Lanka has to try to manage is an increase in what they call direct transfers to the people, right? And one hopes that that can come through a World Bank program where conditional cash transfers are given to the poorest, because they really are suffering with 30% general inflation, 50% food inflation, people on fixed incomes, the daily wage earners, that 500,000 extra people plus who have been thrown into poverty as a result of COVID are really hurting, and that's very visible. But the World Bank has done these cash transfers, and I hope that a program of some $600 million can be worked out so that can immediately come into play, providing we have some principal agreement with the IMF. Now, in terms of the rest of restructuring, I think we're going to have to do several things. The first is we're going to have to look at loss-making state enterprises very seriously and try to privatize those that are possible to be privatized. Because, in the case of the airline, I'm not sure how many takers there were when bids were put out at some points to somehow provide some aspects of equity. The electricity board also likewise needs to be restructured. And we have examples of other types of restructuring that has been introduced into the economy. So loss-making enterprises have to be dealt with. Then there has to be a revenue collection, which will be important. And I think we'll have to basically lower the tax base so that there's a fairer taxation system. Clearly, the richer people will have to pay more tax. The companies will have to pay more tax. And this will hopefully have to be phased in over some time. And then when we have an IMF program, the advantage of it is that you get technical advice from the IMF, which is very important. And having an IMF program will enable Sri Lanka to go again to the capital market to be able to borrow, at some kind of interest rate, even though the bonds will not be much valued. And so this combination of restructuring expenditure, raising taxes, and value-added tax, by the way, will also have to go up to the level it was before. It was some 16, 17%. The Rajapakse regime cut it to practically 8%. So this was a big hit on finances. Plus, being able to go again to the capital market will be important for sources of revenue to get the country back in some state, plus grant money from the World Bank and others to keep the social fabric intact.
Yes, but this would put a new government in an uncomfortable position because it is not such an austerity program is not something that would make a new government a popular government. I mean, they will have to administer this kind of difficult medicine, as it were.
No, this is absolutely the case, which is one of the reasons I suspect Sajid Premadasa, the leader of the opposition, has been reluctant to take over the mantle of the prime ministership or indeed higher office, because they are worried about 3 to 5 year period of austerity, which is what Sri Lanka faces. And let me also say, Ambassador Sood, that I am somewhat optimistic of Sri Lanka being able to come out of this crisis. If we put in place the right set of policies, that is an IMF program coupled with successful negotiation with the creditors and structural reforms, because it's a small economy, it's well positioned in the center of the Indian Ocean. It's only an economy of 22 million people. It's probably equivalent to one city in India. I mean, the population of Delhi may be 20 plus or 30
Yes.
million. Mumbai is much bigger. So, look, this is a solvable problem with the right policies and political will, and those are two conditions. So the policies, I believe, with IMF tutelage and a government that is sensible about policy can be put in place. People's expectations will be very high because they have been suffering, and that is the bit that's very hard. And the biggest risk is the political unrest and the expectations of people, because they have really been hurting. And this is where the early warnings not being followed by the Rajapakse administration are really scary and unforgivable in many ways, and why you have people on the streets. But I feel, we can come out of this if we put something in place, and we need all the help we can get from neighbors. And India has been very supportive by giving Sri Lanka, I think, $3.5 billion of aid so far, with food aid, fuel aid, and other types. So I think with goodwill from neighbors and others and debt moratoria, Sri Lanka can come out. And I think it's worth investing in, because it can be a good development partner and play an important role in the Indian Ocean as a strategic and economic partner.
Dr. Malampati, Dr. Vignaraja just spoke about $3.5 billion of economic aid in terms of credit swaps, lines of credit, etc., etc. You've been following India-Sri Lanka relations, and has there been a change in our relationship over the last, if you were to, let's say, over the last 5-6 years, how would you describe our relationship? How has it shifted? And what have been the principal concerns that we have had in our relationship with Sri Lanka?
So definitely, sir. I think if you look at the India-Sri Lanka relations in the last 6 to 5 years, there is definitely a shift. I think the focus now has been on the strategic and economic elements of cooperation than the political aspects of cooperation. For instance, some of the issues, some of the flashpoints in our bilateral relations has been, the discussions are going on to resolve those issues.
No, which are the flashpoints? Which are the flashpoints?
For instance, there are issues like the ethnic issue, for instance, which in every statement India has said that Sri Lanka should find a domestic solution for that issue. That I think even the Sri Lankan government also agrees.
You're talking about the Tamil issue.
Yeah, Tamil issue,
yes.
And then there is this fisherman issue. These are some of the issues I think India and Sri Lanka tried to resolve through a mutual dialogue way. So India also has supported the few initiatives taken by the UN, for instance. It has supported Sri Lanka. So what has happened was, for instance, after this crisis has hit Sri Lanka, India has responded very quickly. If you look at the international response, I think India is the first country that has responded quickly to the Sri Lankan crisis. Because
sorry, you said there have been certain changes in Indian policy in the last 5-6 years. So which are the changes?
Yeah, the one thing is that India is basically looking at the broader level, like how to engage Sri Lanka, because we have our Indo-Pacific policy, for instance, and Sri Lanka also tried to emerge as an Indian Ocean hub in the post-war period, and the emphasis has been to develop Sri Lanka's ports and other infrastructure, so that the taking opportunities in some more a peace period actually, where there is no LTTE. So that is what I think Sri Lanka tried to take advantage of and tried to put his point across, that Sri Lanka would like to emerge as a commercial and financial hub in the Indian Ocean region, and we have, as India, we have our own Indo-Pacific policy. So that is where I think somewhere both the countries tried to engage with each other. Though there are divergences about how both look at the Indian Ocean or Indo-Pacific. There are a lot of Indo-Pacific itself. So both the countries, I think, try to develop a synergy. If you look at the meetings happened, the NSA level meeting that happened in 2020 and 2021, also try to focus on various issues like counterterrorism, cybersecurity. So the focus has been shifted, and India and Sri Lanka actually engage themselves within the framework of the Indo-Pacific also, though there are apprehensions from the Sri Lankan side regarding Sri Lankan side about, for instance, the Quad, for instance, AUKUS. They look at it in a different perspective altogether. So this is one shift that I can see in the last 5 to 6 years. Other than that, India has, and also economic cooperation, for instance, which has suffered a lot because of the various political reasons. I think even that, I think both the countries try to address at various levels by negotiating with Sri Lanka how to improve trade relations or enhance trade relations in the last few years. So, and then another shift is that the focus now, I think, shifted to the energy cooperation, for instance, and we have signed various agreements in the last 6-7 months in improving, in enhancing the energy cooperation between India and Sri Lanka also. So these are a few of the shifts I see where the focus now, I think, has been on the security and economic aspects of cooperation. Despite the differences we had earlier in the history.
Okay.
I mean, we have seen a lot of up and downs in relations with
Dr. Vignaraja, if you mentioned that in the debt, you said about 10% debt is owed to India, 10% to China, roughly similar.
Sorry, it's 10% to China, 10% to Japan, and about 2% to India.
Oh, okay. So, I mean, in that sense, when you look at how the region, how the countries of Asia have responded to this crisis, how would you judge that in terms of the bilateral talks? Dr. Malampati talked of the frequent exchanges between India and Sri Lanka, and I'm sure we would have had similar exchanges between Sri Lanka and Japan, Sri Lanka and China. How do you look at the regional response?
So India has very much stepped up to the plate in terms of the aid story. I mean, they came very early into this game. There was a Reserve Bank of India swap arrangement that was given to Sri Lanka bilaterally. I think there was also SARC swap, and so $1.4 billion or something was provided through swap arrangements, which have to be paid back. But at the same time, that money is very important to bolster reserves. So that was very important. India has provided food and fuel aid, which has been very important for Sri Lanka as well. So it adds to 3.5 billion, as far as I understand the number. So that has been very timely. With Japan, there has been some emergency assistance provided, but Japan hasn't yet come into play looking at the whole debt issue, although it's very much part of the conversation. And one has to see how that conversation will evolve. One suspects that Japan will be somewhat amenable, given it's a Paris Club member and there are some rules. And I think the Indian minister recently talked about Sri Lanka being considered as a low-income country, partly to initiate a conversation on this debt issue and within certain rules framework. So there is, I think, in Japan, some storyline there about debt restructuring and so on, at least for the future. In the case of China, there's been a very interesting story. As you know, Sri Lanka has become a poster child for this so-called debt trap story, right? Which
Hambantota
port, which was basically, the theory goes, was taken over by the Chinese with a loan, and Sri Lanka was unable to service, and therefore it's a lease and so on. Now, that issue is a bit controversial. I mean, when you look at this 10% share of the debt, it's not quite a story that Sri Lanka's debt trap is entirely made in China. There are elements of China, but it's not entirely made in. My own view there is that what the Chinese did, which was perhaps an error, was that the government under the Rajapakses wanted this area, southern Sri Lanka, Hambantota, where they came from, to develop. And then they asked for a series of projects, Hambantota Port, Martala Airport, the Convention Center, and other projects. And China just delivered these things on a turnkey basis. They didn't do proper infrastructure master planning. So these are the faults, right? They didn't build the capacity of Sri Lanka to do that. There wasn't proper cost-benefit analysis done to look at the returns. And of course, there's the whole issue of anti-corruption and transparency, which was not there in the Chinese project. So these are some of the faults that I think were there in the Chinese response. And then there is the whole issue of imports. So part of our import bill is really these imports for these big infrastructure projects, which were there historically. And so the negative sides are there, while on the positive side, had proper cost-benefit analysis and master planning done, you might have done that with Trincomalee Port, which was a natural harbor rather than go down to the south. And you might have developed a highway system that connected the whole country rather than just the southern part of the country, if you like, right? Now, China, with this debt issue, Sri Lanka asked, President Gotabaya Rajapakse asked the Chinese foreign minister in January for a debt standstill, a debt moratorium for 3 years. China has not been forthcoming to date. They have provided some emergency assistance. They have provided loans to the China Development Bank, I think amounting to about $1 billion, which will basically go into budget support. Now, the reason they are not agreeable so far for a debt moratoria is that if they provide this to Sri Lanka, there's a whole bunch of other countries that are, BRI recipients that are in some distress that may want the same conditions, right, of moratorium. These, range from Nepal to Maldives. In our region, Laos is there, Cambodia is there are a bunch of African countries. So China is worried there'll be this kind of bandwagon effect, saying, look, Sri Lanka got this money, others will be there. A second,
Are you saying that in all of these countries you have similar issues with regard to Chinese projects, that some of these projects seem to be somewhat have been not properly undertaken with the requisite diligence and planning and so on?
So there are good and bad Chinese infrastructure projects, right? The good ones are there when you pick a sector such as energy, which is much needed in many countries. Another good project can be when you connect a road to a port so that the traffic flows are there respective, right? But if you have countries which have gone and put railways. So in Ethiopia, that railway line that the Chinese built is seen as a bit of an issue. Likewise, there are other projects in Pakistan. The CPEG is also seen as a very large investment without the returns that may be wanted. So there are good and bad Chinese projects. The fault I have with this is that China officially argues that it's a independent development partner and helps countries decide what they want to do in their own destiny. The problem with that as a lender is that you may encourage debt creation in countries if you don't also look at the traffic flows and the debt sustainability, which is what the multilateral banks do when they lend money to countries. So infrastructure master planning and providing capacity for infrastructure master planning in countries with BRI has loans have been given is one gap that the Chinese, I think, are there. And then not doing rigorous cost-benefit analysis and environmental sustainability is another big gap. I mean, there have been some of this done, but it's been done very cursorily. And then there's the whole governance issue. There are allegations that on some of the projects in Sri Lanka and elsewhere that, rent-seeking behavior was pursued in some of these projects. And, this sort of information is alleged. Now, so these are some of the challenges which come with Chinese projects. So China is a very good provider of infrastructure, and it builds things very fast on a turnkey basis, but it may put them in regions, for instance, which may not be economically most beneficial to a country, and it doesn't necessarily look at the debt sustainability aspect. So these are old issues. Now, China, in 2019, there was this big BRI conference, which you I'm sure are aware of, BRI Forum, where President Xi said they're going to take account more of the environmental dimension and also of the debt issue, and also look at green projects. So, and the AIIB is supposed to bring that kind of new approach about. So hopefully the newer Chinese projects are better equipped and the newer approach is better equipped, but the early projects were led by state-owned enterprises where a lot of due diligence wasn't necessarily done, and there have been difficult cases. So the debt trap is kind of a glass half full story. And I think we can improve on this, not just for China, by the way, but for all other kinds of bilateral aid that's given. I mean, including potentially what India might do in the future on its bilateral aid and so on. And I think we've learned a lot of lessons on how better bilateral aid can be delivered. That's my basic point, right? So I pick out China.
Well, I think Dr. Malampati is having some difficulty with her connection because I see her coming and going. But there was something she mentioned about Indo-Pacific. So, she said that there are differences in perception about Indo-Pacific, that Sri Lanka, how does Sri Lanka look at Indo-Pacific or at AUKUS for that matter?
So Sri Lanka, I think, was trying to play this kind of balancing game of sort of trying to use China as an infrastructure provider while, trying to keep a balance with other interests such as military and so on. And we're not wanting to either annoy China or India. And I think Gotabaya Rajapakse, when he came in, shifted the perception which people had of Mahinda Rajapakse's previous regime, that he was very pro-Chinese. And as you know, when 2 Chinese submarines came to Sri Lanka in 2014, that generated a significant protest from India. And so Sri Lanka is sort of trying to make up its mind of how to position itself in this strategic conundrum. My own view is really Sri Lanka should look at this context of the Indian Ocean and also India's important neighbourhood. And I feel that Sri Lanka should sign a defence pact with India and the Maldives and perhaps other countries, so that we keep the Indian Ocean a very tension-free region, so that economically it can develop. And others may come for economic purposes, but those should be very carefully looked at with cost-benefit analysis and also through political lens. And in AUKUS, Sri Lanka is, as you know, not part of that narrow arrangement, But we should certainly take a view on the Indo-Pacific in my own sort of thinking. And because we are an important port location, for transshipment trade to India, which I think is important. I think half of, most of Colombo port's output is to transshipment trade with India because of the pork strait issue, and the big ships come into Colombo and they are unloaded, and the smaller ships then come to Indian ports, which is what I understand the way this trade works. And also, I think, for a small country, pursuing a neutral approach is a very logical approach, and Sri Lanka should try to adhere to that, within a broader framework of the Indian Ocean, and be cognizant of India's security interests. And I think that should be very much a new approach for Sri Lanka. And we should build a trade and investment relationship with India, which is much needed. So I hope that from aid, which we desperately need at the moment, bridging finance and food aid and all of those important areas to come out of this. And then we should take a broader look at India-Sri Lanka relations through the prism, I hope, of trade, investment, security relations. And I think, in the Indian Ocean, we can all prosper.
I had one sort of last question for you. In terms of, you said you are optimistic about a time frame within which Sri Lanka can overcome this kind of crisis. Now, is there a provision somewhere, or is there some thinking of having, instead of a politically led government? Because as you said, given the harsh medicine, the bitter medicine that has to be administered, no political leader would like to take on this responsibility. Is there some thinking about a technocratic government which could take over for, let us say, an interim period of, say, something like 2 years, and then so that period can be used to rebuild the economy? And that can be followed by elections where the political leadership can once again come back into play.
So the Bar Association in Sri Lanka, which have been very active in supporting, this political transition that we are facing, has put forward a proposal, I think, for an interim government to be in place for some 18 months and a small cabinet, and after which elections can be held. They haven't specified necessarily the technocratic part, but I think when you look at other experiences of countries in difficulty, there was Mario Monti who emerged in Italy after a crisis.
Yes.
As an EU bureaucrat who came in. There is Mario Draghi, who's
right now in Italy. Yes, we've also had it in Nepal. We've had similar situations in Nepal, closer home, where they brought in more of a neutral, like a former chief justice was brought in.
Yes. So I think that would be a very useful sort of interim solution to stabilize it, and a government composed of technocrats. We've had this in Latin America, during the various crises, right? And I think we need to be drawing more lessons from Latin America, right, as to how you manage these debt kind of crises. Because we're not, so cognizant of this in South Asia. I think, in the Sri Lankan case, a caretaker government with full powers, dedicated towards trying to manage this economic transition, because the challenge Sri Lanka faces at the moment really is this economic transition, which is quite complex and difficult, with these unprecedented debt discussion taking place with creditors, an IMF program, which we've had, by the way, 16 of, so this will be our 17th IMF program. So we have some experience of that. And then managing a structural reform program that can eventually generate growth on a trend basis would be very nice. We have to get those important things done while ensuring, democracy is looked at and observed. And one of the slight, worries that I have is this kind of political tension that we are seeing between the president and the other parliamentarians in the opposition. There seems to be a lack of a national consensus of the seriousness of the economic crisis and the need to really come together and form a government, even if it is a cohabitation, with the current president as one extreme, at least for an interim period, followed by the need to really fix the economy and ensure basic needs of the poor, because without dealing with the hardships of the poor, we're not going to have much to govern, right, as a country. going forward, and maintaining a neutral foreign policy as we go along. One other brief point, if I might say, my optimism is really come from Sri Lanka being a small country, and I think these problems are severe and the worst in our economic history, but with the right political will and the right policy mix and goodwill from neighbors such as India in particular, we can come through this. And the other dimension, which I think is very important, if I may, just for 30 seconds, is really we should look to a more sustainable relationship with India. We should connect Sri Lanka better to India through links with the South Indian states, which are natural. And that means Jaffna and the airport and also the sea line being connected. And I think that would be very beneficial to both India and Sri Lanka. We should look at leveraging the port that India is now running. There's one terminal, the Adani are there. And that I think is a very important aspect of India's transshipment trade. We should also look at encouraging much more people-to-people contact and business contact. And then eventually, when time is right, we should look to upgrading the trade agreement with India, because I think that will hopefully lead to Sri Lanka coming more into the game, both as an IT hub. Indian IT companies went off to the Philippines because they didn't, necessarily come into Sri Lanka and the neighboring countries because the labor shortage is there. And also eventually for a manufacturing capacity with India. So I feel that the relationship can be very good in the future, providing Sri Lanka can come out of this. And if we sign, defense and other types of agreements, hopefully India's security and other fears can realize. So I feel the Sri Lanka-India relationship can be good. There are thorny issues, as Samatha pointed out, and I think those also have to be resolved. So I feel somewhat optimistic of possibilities that may be there. Of course, there are many risks in the interim.
Thank you. I think that is a positive and a hopeful note to end on. Essentially, we are in the middle of a crisis. We have to see how it unfolds. But if Sri Lanka is able to come out of it well, and with India playing a positive role in helping Sri Lanka at this crucial moment, the prospects of closer ties, both in the economic as well as in the security sector between India and Sri Lanka, can take the region forward to mutual benefit. So let me just thank you, Dr. Malempati and Dr. Vignaraja. I'm sure, given the fact that this is an unfolding story, we'll probably need to come back with another session on this pretty soon. Thank you.